It feels weird talking to yourself. They say extroverts like talk to think, right? And so I do have a little bit of that of I need to kind of like talk through some of everything that's going on in my head. It kind of helps me clarify my own thoughts and then later, hone those even more for my writing. So it's kind of a good like thinking process for me, weirdly.
Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Justin Brown. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. For some reason, and I don't know what it is, but people in B2B seem to feel like guest-based interviews are the only way to create a podcast episode. And don't get me wrong, I love conducting interviews. I love the relationships that are built out of interviews, and I'm doing an interview today. But there are two major problems with guest-based interviews. Number one, you don't have control over the execution. You're dependent on people outside of yourself to conduct an interview. And for example, if you're counting on 2 to 3 people to record over the next 2 to 3 weeks, and all of them push for one reason or another, well, you can find yourself at risk of missing your publish dates. It can be tough to always have to find guests on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. Having to wrangle guests is always going to be a necessary evil, but it doesn't have to be your only approach. The second reason is that as much good content as you do get out of a guest-based interview, no matter how much you try to insert yourself into the convo and have it be very conversational, you are essentially conducting an interview of a subject matter expert, and that subject matter expert is not you in this situation. Sometimes it's fun to be the one highlighting your own expertise because likely if you're running a show in your space, you have some expertise that you can lend. It's why I've repurposed my appearances on other shows onto my show and also do solo episodes regularly. Today, I want to talk about solo episodes and what better way to do it than to have the uber talented Camille Trent on to talk about her very first solo podcast episode, at least on Content Logistics, which is the show that Camille hosts. And she recently recorded her first solo episode about how to evaluate content marketing job opportunities. So with that, Camille, welcome to Recorded Content.
Hey, Justin. Yeah, you're too kind about that. But yeah, I'm really passionate about this topic. I know you guys are subject matter experts in this topic as well as podcasting. So we'll have a lot to riff on.
Yeah, absolutely. So you and I have been talking about you doing a solo episode to try to help supplement guest interviews. What sparked you to sit down and do it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys gave me the extra nudge I needed. It was one of those things where it's like, is this a good idea? I had it in the back of my mind of when I have a topic that I want to cover that I feel like I'm a subject matter expert in, right? That I can go deep in and it's relevant to the audience. When I come across those, I'm happy to do it. But you also need that little bit of like outside push, I think, to do your first of anything, right? So you get comfortable like in one thing, this is working, you get good feedback about it. But then it was kind of the same with having 2 guests on, right? Like I wouldn't have known that would have a positive feedback until I did it. It was like everything was working pretty well. It wasn't like people were hungry for different type of content. At least I wasn't getting that feedback. But it's like, I think there's an opportunity here. Let's chase it. Let's mix up the format. Like that's kind of like how you keep the momentum going. Weirdly, is by mixing it up.
And I loved how you started it out saying, all right, it's 11:58 p.m. and I have no guest. How did it feel to do an episode with just yourself?
It feels weird. I'm not going to lie. It feels weird talking to yourself. I mean, I'm a little bit, they say extroverts like talk to think, right? And so I do have a little bit of that of I need to kind of like talk through some of everything that's going on in my head. So I do think that there's that, like it kind of helps me clarify my own thoughts and then later, hone those even more for my writing. So it's kind of a good like thinking process for me, weirdly, and I can go on for a while. So it's once I'm going, it doesn't feel that weird. I'm sure everyone is like this, but that the first like few minutes, and this is the same with with any interview podcast too. Like the first few minutes are brutal. It's always awkward. So once you get past that, I think it was actually more normal than I thought it was.
And one of the things that I talk a lot about when it comes to podcasting, and I write about it all the time, is trying to tackle problems or issues on a podcast and the benefit of that. And for me, the biggest benefit of going into a podcast so like my ideal guest profile, right, is like B2B podcaster. And I always talk about how going into an episode, if I just went in saying I'm going to have a convo or a chat with another B2B podcaster, that I'm actually more nervous about that than having a really strong topic, because when I go into that conversation, I'm really hoping that the guest brings it, right? And they have like a good story to tell. Whereas when I go in with a good topic, like today, right? The problem is time and coordination, and how potentially a solo episode can help with that, right? I come into the conversation feeling very strong about it. And I think you did that as well here with a lot of your prep for going solo. You had a really solid foundation that you laid out heading into it. You talked about your list and really worked off of that. And for the audience, she had this list of things to consider when identifying your next role. It was stage, industry, leadership, business model, job description, growth, brand, product. I think I nailed it all. You'll have to you'll have to go listen to her episode to hear specifically about that. But how did you go about preparing the list and your script for this episode?
Yeah, I mean, so to back up even further, I think it's like timing, right? So the ability as a content marketer to identify like the times in your career or the times in your life or whatever went on that day where you had like a light bulb moment, where you had some sort of like learning, and being able to kind of like jot that down or earmark it as like a topic, like as content. And so one of those times where I was transitioning to a different role, it reminded me of couple years back, like when I was transitioning to another role, and I had someone reach out and say, "Hey, why did you take this job?" And I had to think about it, and I came up with kind of 5 core things. And but it forced me to do that. Like having someone ask, like, forced me to, one, understand that other people are interested in this type of content, or other people need some sort of like framework to consider, and then 2, just kind of like developing what that framework was, like because I had it, but I hadn't ever like thought to put it in a list, if that makes sense. So then, fast forward to now, I was in that position again. And I was like, I kind of want to get specific, like while I'm thinking about it, while it's fresh, like what were the things that I considered? Because that list had expanded, and in the past couple of years, and also just as you change as a human, right? Like you're going to prioritize different things. And so that list changes. And so while it was fresh, I wanted to be able to kind of share my process with other people, because I'd started getting kind of, interestingly, like other kind of DMs that were around similar topics of kind of like, how do I ask for promotion? What salary bands, like, should I be thinking for this? All of those types of things it's starting to get more questions about, and are things that I honestly wish that I had earlier on. So I think like once you hit a couple of those things, is this the type of content that I would appreciate, since I'm my audience in this case? And questions that, I've considered in the past, am I getting asked about it a lot? And then that just becomes kind of like the signal, I guess, that you need to kind of create the content.
And so when you were actually recording, and maybe we can just work through both, what specifically did you prepare for the episode, so that you made sure when you were talking to camera that you had notes or a script, or how did that work?
Yeah, so I had notes. I just had a piece of paper that I'd scribbled out my list of the top 10 things. By each thing, I kind of had a bullet points next to them, kind of just like a web, basically, of things connected to it. It's kind of how I like to think about things. So had all those things connected to each of the 10 points. It's kind of easy for me to go down the list and talk to each of the sub lists, I guess, within that, like the sub points within there. So it keeps it pretty open, so that you're not feeling like you're reading off a script, right? But you have something to refer back to, so that you feel prepared throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, and one of the things that you mentioned was that you did grab that list from something that you'd previously written or created, which is something I do a lot of times. Is I actually build out my solo episodes from a blog post that's already been written into a podcast. I always kind of joke about it that people only feel like they can build blog posts off of podcasts, but I actually take my blog posts and turn them into podcasts. So what gave you the idea to use a previously written or created piece or list for your podcast episode?
Yeah, I mean, just content marketing 101, right? Or content distribution 101, maybe. So having done similar things of thinking in terms of that Russian doll, I guess, mentality is how I think about it, is for anyone who doesn't know, like the doll within a doll within the doll. And so I think about it, if you have a post that does really well, and it's like, what was it about that did well? And if it's the content, and if it's, listicle type style, that's really easy to lend itself to a blog, like to a podcast, right? So thinking about micro content and expanding that, and then also thinking about, macro content and then condensing that down. So I think the best ways to think about this are podcast or long form blog, really easy kind of pillar macro content that you can condense down. And then if you just have an idea, but you kind of want to validate it, sometimes the easiest way is to kind of just like throw that on Twitter, throw that on LinkedIn, get kind of that validation, or see who it's resonating with, right? Like maybe it resonates with content marketers, but you're looking for VPs of marketing, right? And so seeing kind of like who it resonates with and if it's the right type of content to create more of.
And what did you like most about doing the solo episode?
Yeah, I mean, I liked that I didn't have to depend on Inwood. Like I love doing the interviews, right? But I think knowing that there's this other format that I can consider to creating content, that's kind of empowering, right? And then I also think just being able to mix it up, like I notice that I get fatigue, right, with other shows when they have like the same format every time. And I look forward to kind of like new formats on, and you think about this with TV shows, right? Like even like the media that you consume outside of B2B and paying attention to those kind of signals. But then also with podcasts, like I appreciate when guests and hosts kind of mix it up. So I liked kind of doing that experiment with multiple guests, and that was uncomfortable at first, but had good feedback. And so that was kind of the motivator for, hey, let's try like another format where it's just me. I feel like I have something to talk about. And I think that's the other big like gate for this. If you really don't have anything to talk about, or in some cases, the host may not be the subject matter expert, right? Then like maybe that's not a good fit. But oftentimes you are, and you've probably talked to enough subject matter experts, even if you aren't, that you're slowly becoming one, right? Like, so you could even do an episode that's just, here are the learnings from talking to 100 product marketers or whatever your category is.
Yeah, for sure. One of the episodes that I've done with one of our customers on this show, he's a marketer, he's a writer by trade, and he now hosts a show in the financial technology space, and he talks to CFOs like the CFO of Peloton and stuff like that, like these pretty impressive financial individuals. And he's kind of said the same thing, which is, it's funny, going in, I was really nervous of, even being the host of this show. But now, if you think about it, what CFOs in his space have had 100 conversations with other CFOs? Probably none of them. I mean, he's probably had more conversations with people in his space that's not even quote unquote his space, where he more identifies as a marketer than a financial person. But he's had more conversations with CFOs in technology than probably 99% of people in finance, which I find fascinating, watching marketers become pseudo experts. It's like they're like experts in knowledge. Like they've gained more knowledge than anyone else, at least from talking to that certain profile, which I always just find fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, they're probably the best position to be curators, right? Because they have like this collection of knowledge and like brain tapping that they can use for also like quantitative sort of like insights too. You could probably put together like a report of all of the tools, that content marketers use or CFOs use, right? And so it's interesting because ultimately, even the most impressive like subject matter experts that you can think of are mostly like experts in their experience, which is something that my friend Zoe says a lot. Like, well, if you don't feel like you're an expert in your experience. And so on the flip side of that, the marketer, the host in that situation, they can be kind of like an expert in that market. Like once you've interviewed and talked to enough, the best of the best, like the cream of the crop within your industry, it's hard to say that you're not an expert, right? Once you get to that point. And I don't think, you ever get to that unless you're a content marketer interviewing other content marketers or something like that. But you do get a lot more confident. And I've talked to enough hosts of podcasts that feel this way that I know it's true.
Yeah, which is one of the reasons that I really push for marketing to be the hosts of the show, is the real deep understanding that they get of their space. And right, I love that. It's like, he's not an expert on being a CFO, right? Like, he's not going to go from being a marketing podcast host to being the CFO of a company, but nobody is a bigger expert on talking to CFOs. Like, he's got that one, above, again, 99% of people.
Yeah, because it's like, why are you doing it to begin with, right? And there's the, creating a media company, there's the actual marketing things, the outward marketing things. But then if you look at the core of like what marketing should be, it's like understanding your market, right? So if you're thinking about this as customer research, and even if you get nothing else from that, doing a podcast is probably worth it just for that, just for the customer research insights that you can get and becoming the expert on the market. Like you said, you're not going to be a CFO overnight, but you can at least have greater empathy for the challenges that a CFO face, and that hopefully you can help solve.
Yeah. And so when I'm selling podcast services, and I joke with people about this a lot, is the number one thing people are looking for when they come to me is content marketing support, and the podcast can do that for them. The number two thing that they want to know is about results. Are we going to get leads from this? And that's a fun conversation in and of itself. And way down the totem pole that I don't even put into my sales deck is prospective customer or customer research. Nobody wants to hear about market research when I'm selling them podcast services. And the number one thing that I hear from my customers after 6 months to a year, when I ask them, what's just been the best part of doing this, and it's the deep understanding of the people in their space. And I just think that's so funny, is that I still haven't cracked the code on how to convince someone to podcast based on market research, but that is like the number one piece of feedback that I get back, that people are like, I've just learned so much. I've developed messaging for my business, or for our business, around the podcast, and really based on what people have told me.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, it's like, I'll stand by. I think it's worth doing it for that. But the other part of it, and kind of what convinces me to keep doing it, right, or to keep thinking about it as a strategy for different companies, is it's a high leverage activity, right? So because you're doing the customer research, you are talking to the right people. Like, there's almost you get to know the rest of the community, right? So it's a community marketing play now, right? And then there's also just the content that you'll get from it that both helps you become better at your craft, right? And have a better understanding of who your audience is, but also just the content that you can cut up, both from solo episodes and from those guest episodes. So that's most of what marketing should be, right? Is like identifying the big bets, like the high leverage opportunities, and not like overwhelming yourself with like trying to be the best at everything.
Yeah, exactly. And, just really getting so much out of one activity. When we talk about who we help and who we work with, it's small marketing teams of 1 to 5 typically. And those people are trying to get the most things that they can get out of the small amount of things that they have time for, and finding the best way to do that. And then getting having this podcast that does everything from customer research to relationship building to community building to content creation. There's really a lot that falls under that umbrella. The next question I wanted to ask you was, okay, so you've done this solo episode, you enjoyed it to an extent, maybe. You can tell me. But now that you have one under your belt, how often do you plan on doing a solo episode versus guest-based interviews? Is it going to be something that, you'll do here and there? Is it something you want to incorporate into your playbook? What's your feeling there?
Yeah, so I'm thinking at least every other month is kind of where I'm at. And so for the audience listening, I do one 2 a month, right? And so bi-monthly, if you think about it that way. So then every other month, like that's kind of one out of 4 is what I'm thinking. But it partly depends on, there's another segment that I'm looking to stand up that would be kind of reoccurring with the same guest. And that could be every month. And so it kind of depends like what you have in your pipeline, right? And then what other segments and formats that you might want to set up, right? And then just the cadence that you want to kind of like set with everything. So that's kind of my thought. It could be as much as like, once a month. So it depends too if like I want to do one every week. That would change like the cadence, how often I would want to do it. But that's kind of where I'm at right now, is finding a few different formats that really work, and then developing like a cadence for each of them. So it's kind of like somewhat expected and also becomes a forcing function so that I actually do it. The other thing that I'll add here is just where you are at in podcasting. Like you'll reach a point where it feels like you've talked to everybody. You have it, and there's more digging to do, right? But you will like reach that point where you've talked to maybe like all of the macro influencers in the space, right? And then you have to consider, okay, am I going to start talking to micro influencers? Do I go by brand? Like there's people that maybe aren't as loud but are maybe even better at their job, right? And so you either need to find other ways to kind of like find those people and prospect once it becomes people outside of your kind of circle, or you find different formats, right? And so this does give like a nice balance to it.
Yeah, for sure. I think establishing those different styles of episode are huge for podcasts, where it doesn't have to be this guest-based interview every time. And, you mentioned talking to everybody in your space. And even just aside from that, I mean, I personally, I get bored. I mean, I've done so many interviews over the years. I mean, I've probably conducted over 200 interviews with maybe more, maybe like 300 interviews with B2B marketers. Not that I don't enjoy doing that, but at some point I want to try something a little bit different and do something a little bit different. And we really have, we are still, and I love your idea of trying to establish a recurring style of episode. My business partner and co-host of the show, Tristan, and I right now are actively trying to figure out what our recurring aspect of this show is going to be, aside from guest interviews. And look, we've established all of these over years of doing this. Right now we have guest-based interviews, we have solo episodes, we have our founder series where Tristan and I talk to each other, and then we have episodes where we pull in pieces from old episodes and then speak to them, and then cut to it and speak to it and cut to it and speak to it. So we already have like 3 to 4 styles of episode. We're working on a recurring bit, around something. And I think that's huge to be able to diversify, not only for your own bandwidth, but also just for the sake of it's entertaining to do different things and people get bored.
Yeah, that's a really good point too. Is I think most marketers have this like itch at some point too. Like it's like I gotta be like creating something new. I gotta be like experimenting with something. And so recognizing that if you're bored, like it's gonna show, right? And if you're bored, your audience is probably bored a little bit. I mean, asterisks there because you can feel that way, when you're posting every day. And I still think it's a good idea to post every day. So try and like rein in your own biases. But I think recognizing that in yourself of like the most important thing is consistency and momentum, right? And so if you're getting bored, then you're at risk like for not doing it, like for pausing, you know what I mean? For losing some of that momentum. So whatever you can do to kind of like keep yourself excited and keep yourself on track is probably a good idea.
Yeah, for sure. And the way that I've really done that has been, I'm not bored right now, audience, and Camille. The way that I've done that and kept myself really invigorated for guest interviews is 2 things. One is spicing it up by doing other things so that when I do come back to a guest interview, I'm excited about the guest interview, because I'm not, we're probably on about a similar cadence to what you are, which is like, 2 to 3 out of every 4 are interviews, and then the other 2 are like some other style. And so for me, when I go do another interview, I'm excited about it. And then a second piece of keeping me excited about guest interviews is really focusing on problems, right? Like I didn't bring you on today and say, all right, Camille, you're a B2B podcaster. So tell me about podcasting. What's it like? How did you get into it? How did you develop your show? And I hear a lot of shows that do that. They bring on their ideal guest person and they just talk to them about their experiences. But rather, today we're like, okay, you did your first solo episode. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about the wins, what went well, what you can work on, so on and so forth. So having a really well-defined topic and then having other things outside of just guest interviews have helped to keep me very invigorated in that style that is the more common approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Like just you mentioning some of the different styles that you use for this podcast has made me think about, okay, like there's a couple other styles that I'd kind of had in the back of my mind, but I've never actually tried, never activated. And so, yeah, you really can get creative. I've never heard of, chopping up other episodes, right? And then breaking them down, having commentary about it. But that's kind of a fun, style. Like thinking about you as the commentary, right? Like as a baseball commentary, sort of a similar thing, but for B2B is a fun concept. So yeah, there's a lot there to unpack. So I'll try and nail the solo episode, a couple other formats first, because you have to also know like what your weakness is. And sometimes my weakness is wanting to try everything, wanting to do like a little bit of everything. So I think like slowly like mastering kind of one thing of like, okay, I feel comfortable with, guest interviews. I'm feeling comfortable with this other format, couple guests on at once, comfortable with solo, and kind of like knowing yourself and being able to kind of stack rank those accordingly.
Yeah. And, I tell people I did about 200 guest interviews before I started doing other styles of episodes. So it really is like a slow rollout to get comfortable with all of these different styles. I think if you try and bite off more than you can chew up front, they are disjointed or just simply don't happen. And so it is like getting comfortable with a different style and then saying, okay, I've got that. I've got the guest interviews. I did maybe 10, 20, 30, 40 of those, maybe more. And then, all right, I want to mix something else into my repertoire. Maybe I do a recurring segment with somebody, maybe I try a solo episode, get good at that, and then move on to something else. And then, by the end of it, or, with podcasting, maybe there is no end to it. But as you continue to grow, you develop these new skills and plays that you can fold into your podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of like a couple of podcasters come to mind, like Dave Gerhardt, like Chris Walkers of the world, right? And occasionally they'll post like 15-minute episodes or solo episodes or just really a thought that came to mind that day. And I think when you consume that kind of content and you're like, oh, I'm listening to this. This is interesting to me. Like it might feel like a weird thing to do, but I think when you hear it, when you're on the other end of it and you see that it works, that's kind of validating as well. So if it's good content, it'll probably work.
And so another thing I wanted to ask about was, it's great that this worked and that you have this new play in your playbook. But in looking in Squadcast where we recorded it, you didn't just jump on and nail everything your first time. There was more than one take, which there obviously is going to be. For me, there is every time, and I've done a ton of them. What was the most difficult part of doing a solo episode?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first time you do it, you don't know what the right type of outline is, right? And so for me, like it's recording the intro or just getting those first like few minutes right. Because you just don't know how to be like, it's me here, just me. So that I think like took a few takes. And then the other thing was I had probably like 2 brain freezes like the first time when I was running through the whole thing. And so I just like stopped it and then did a new take. And that would have been fine. So we can clip it together. But then it was also, can I get this a little bit tighter? And so I like wanted to kind of run through it again, because then you feel a little more prepared. I had some time. I mean, I had some time. It was like really late at night. I don't know if had some time. Is the right term, but
you're nuts setting out to record an episode at midnight, but I commend that immensely.
It's quiet. No one else is awake. Like, you guys should try it. Anyways, so I just recorded like the whole thing again, and it did get a little bit tighter, a little bit shorter, right? And so it was kind of just one of those things where you put in a couple extra minutes, or even in this case, maybe an extra hour, to kind of suss out like what it takes or the feel that you want for it. And then hopefully like the next time it's a little bit easier because you've kind of put in the work beforehand. I think that's a good rule of thumb in general of putting in extra time, more time than you think that you want to for that first time that you set out on a new campaign, a new content type. Putting in the extra time to do it right kind of the first time makes everything kind of downhill from there.
And if you want to hear about how I completely cheat this system, I have a teleprompter. And what I do is I'm the same way as you. I like to talk out my talking points. So what I do is I go into Google Docs on my phone and I put in headphones because I do a lot of my good talking, I guess, like walking around like I'm on the phone or something. So I put in headphones that have, a speaker on them, my Bose headphones, and it's connected to Google Docs. And I put on the transcription function and I just walk around and I just talk to the topic and it all gets transcribed out. I then build an actual script that I'm going to read off of the teleprompter based on my own words. And that way, so then I once I have it all transcribed, I tighten it up the way that I want it to look because I don't always write like I talk. So Tristan is very different. So Tristan will just write out all of his thoughts. I want to talk out my thoughts. So I talk them out. They get transcribed. I tighten them up, make it really clean with my ideas in line, put it on a teleprompter, and then I'm ready to go. So now this little mini tech stack that I've built has been like 3 years in the process. So don't think you need to go out and do that tomorrow, but you find things that work for you. I just cracked the code on this transcription idea like 2 weeks ago. I was talking to Tristan about it. I was like, I like to talk more than to write and I'm better at it. And he's like, well, why don't you just transcribe into Google Docs? I'm like, that is genius. Thank you. So, I think it takes a lot of work and finding ways to getting what's in your head onto paper. Everybody kind of has their own approach to it in terms of building a plan for your solo episode. And I found that once I kind of get going like you, I'm able to then riff off of my own ideas, but really getting into that is probably the hardest part. But with that, I think that's a great spot to end since we're coming up on our time. I know you mentioned in the episode that you're starting a new position. So where can people go to find you?
Yeah, I mean, you can always still find me on LinkedIn, it turns out. Although Twitter is the hack, you can probably, if you DM me there, like I'm just more likely to respond because it's crickets over there for me. But the new company is PeerSignal. So PeerSignal.org, shameless plug, is a free resource where you can find some GTM strategies of the best PLG companies out there, B2B companies. So think about the Miro, ClickUps, Airtable, all of those of the world. Like, what are they all doing to win? And how can you steal some of those ideas for yourself? This is everything from template strategies to pricing pages. So we try and gather all of that data, analyze it, give it to you for free. And then we also are probably the best resource for kind of identifying your ICP and being able to kind of curate these like perfect sales lists to be able to go after the right SaaS companies.
Awesome. We already sound up to speed and it'll be exciting to see what you do there. Camille, thanks again. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. It was great having you on Recorded Content.
Always.
Thanks for listening to Recorded Content, a show brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcasting agency for B2B tech marketers. We do the podcast stuff so you can focus on strategy, building brand awareness, and developing new relationships. To learn more about how you can launch and grow a podcast for your company, check out motionagency.io. Thanks for listening to Recorded Content.